Meet Reed Lance Rosenthal, rancher, #1 best-selling award-winning author, and unabashedly, unapologetically on the right side of the outstanding issues of our generation. But don't try to fence him in. Sometimes his positions will surprise you, because Reed is definitely his own man, with his own opinions. You might love him, you might hate him, but you won't be able to stop listening. Step over to the right side with Reed.
Howdy, listeners and viewers, coast to coast, the Gulf to the 51st state. I crack up every time I say that. And around the globe. Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take. Please, folks, remember, if you like the show, pass the link on to folks who need this information and don't have it. And I think everybody does, or everybody does need this information. Unfortunately, not a lot of people have the link. And hit the like, hit the subscribe, hit the little bell, let you know when these shows are coming out. Well, I wanted to get this show out 3 days ago. I'm advancing here on the number of shows within a compressed period of time, but I didn't quite make my goal. My apologies. As it turns out, as it always turns out, by being a few days tardy here, all sorts of new news has broken. I'm just going to mention one today. We're going to go into it in depth in the next show, which is really about the dollar. The story is really about the devolvement, the really apparent dissolving of the London Gold Exchange and the London Silver Exchange, the London Metal, the LBMA, which has been the price fixing and kind of central hub for metals and currency, because metals are real money and fiat currency, those dollars you have in your pocket, is not real money, been the hub for centuries. And it seems that they may be going down in flames with worldwide reverberations and direct impact to your pocket and your pocketbook and your wallet. That's the next show, which, by the way, by hook or crook, I'm going to have out here within 72 hours, 3 days. But today, we're going to be going over the second half, I hope we get it all done in one show, of the dissolution, I think the pending dissolution, of the European Union. There's lots of institutions around the globe, just with those two little tidbits, that seem to be falling apart, don't you think? And there's all sorts of reasons for the impending implosion of the European Union and its effect on the rest of the world's economy, the United States, and you. But you need to understand, number one, what the European Union is. I brought you in the last show a few days ago the history of the European Union. If you haven't listened to it, listen to it. It's fascinating. It's the roots of most of us, right? This is where we came from. And it's one of the dominant world powers, those 28 nations that comprise the uneasy union right now. China, the European Union, Russia, and the United States. And one of them is about to go down. So, let's start the show, shall we? And I think, given this show, I have a great quote for you by George R. Martin. Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder. That's right. We're surrounded by chaos, are we not? But in the chaos, there is an order, folks. The chaos may look like the fulcrum falling over, the supports tipping inwards, but it really is a ladder to a new way of doing things, a new way of thinking about things, so long as you're thinking outside the box, so long as you are thinking the what ifs, the could be's, the effects on you, the effects on your family. If you are stuck in the day-to-day, if you have not taken at least a little piece of the red pill, it's time you do so. Because forewarned is forearmed, and knowledge is power, which is why I do this show. The ranch story. Well, we are well along now in our winter prep, In fact, just a few things left to do. We got a lot of the road repair done here over the last week and a half. Yesterday, one of the reasons I did not get the show out yesterday we put the second coat, if you will, like a coat of paint, but in this case, a coat of gravel on the repair areas. We're going to let that set up, hopefully get a little moisture, get pounded into the underlying strata by the movement of vehicles and machines, and then we'll put on the final coat, the smooth coat, the one that feels like the superhighway driving down the ranch road. Well, maybe not quite. The ranch road will never be an interstate. And I have some more pictures for you today. I understand we didn't get them posted in the last show, but we got a bunch for you today, so you can enjoy them. We got 55, I think, plus or minus bales of hay being picked up with luck this week by hay buyers, which is great because that's 55 bales we don't have to stack for winter. And stacking bales for winter just right to keep them as weather tight as possible, since we don't have a hay barn yet, is rather important if you're going to maintain their value, and they are going to maintain their integrity. All right. The other thing that we got done for winter, we've got some wood cut, although we have more to do for the wood stove here in the house, which does a hell of a job of saving propane over the course of the winter. In fact, I'd almost like to add another wood stove in another portion of the house, but perhaps that's overkill. And we have a whole bunch of things, little things to do. There seems to be no shortage of things to do to either get ready for spring when irrigation starts, or to get ready for winter when the earth shuts down, more or less. There's minerals to buy for the horses, get that ready to go so we can bring them out when the weather is really inclement, as a supplement for their feed. There's still some fence to fix where the elk have knocked it down around the pivot field, because cows are in the pivot and eastward on the ranch, and the horses are just outside the pivot and westward on the ranch, starting in about 2 weeks. So I could go over other things for you too, but it'll give you an idea of all the stuff there is to do. And I'm pleased to say we're on schedule and nearing the end. The end of winter prep is in sight. We'll know we're done when we put the plow on the plow truck, and that is just a week or so away. Let's get the show started, shall we? I'm going to do a really, really, really brief rat-a-tat-tat today. Most of it international stuff you aren't hearing about, but you need to. Go back to that quote, chaos, right? It's chaos around the globe, folks, not just chaos here in the United States. We are not alone in the chaos company, shall we say. So, deadly riots in Indonesia just a few weeks ago, and not over yet. And the president there, Subianto, decided not to use the military, but he is using kind of a semblance of martial law to try and maintain order. Indonesia, by the way, is Southeast Asia's largest economy. And many people have fled there from around the globe because they figure it's safe. Well, so much for safe places. So safe places may not exist in a time of chaos, right? But chaos is a ladder. To what, we're not really sure, but each little piece of chaos is but a rung that we are all climbing together. Argentina's central bank, things were going really well for Milei down in Argentina with his revamping and reforms, and it's run into a roadblock. Number one, the left is trying to block him because getting things done with speed is paramount. You can see the same thing happening here in the United States. The blockage is by the left because they would rather that America fail, or that Trump fail, or that we fail, than to stay the course, do the right thing, and, employ common sense rather than dogma and doctrine. Anyway, in Argentina, for the first time since back in April, which was, if you remember, when the tariffs were announced and there was all sorts of volatility in the market, the Argentina Central Bank had to step in and create kind of a trading band for the Argentinian peso. And they sold $53 million worth of pesos just a few days ago to try and stabilize the currency. Now, listen, in American terms, trillions, that's not a lot. In Argentinian terms, it's quite a bit. Anyway, there are things afoot in the economy of Argentina, which hopefully Milei can get straightened out, because it would be an absolute shame for that country to again drift left after really moving far along the right, and I say that both in the vernacular and as a metaphor, lines. And it also will play havoc if Argentina slips back to the left with American foreign policy in South America. Myanmar, right? Whoever hears about Myanmar? Well, Myanmar is a mess, folks. There is a right-leaning insurgency in Myanmar. Many people are dissatisfied with the totalitarian left government. Growing distress, right? We're back to the chaos theme again. Growing distress and discord. And the Myanmar government, unlike the Indonesian government, decided to be heavy-handed. In over 50 instances, they have attacked peaceful gatherings of protesters or festival goers. They have killed over 4,000, shall we say, people who don't think the way they're supposed to in just the last year. And last week, using motorized drones, kind of a paraglider type situation, they dropped bombs on a peaceful festival gathering, absolutely peaceful, and killed 40 men, women, and children, and wounded 80 more. Obviously, this is making the population not less restless, but more restless. We'll keep our eyes on that, because every little bit of chaos adds to total chaos. And total chaos is the real ladder, the real rungs that we are climbing. And the one piece of domestic news, although I could spend 3 shows on it, but I think really noteworthy, and that is Trump is formally declaring Antifa as a terrorist organization. In fact, a foreign terrorist organization. Obviously, the FBI has come into some information which would seem to suggest that Antifa is not just, a couple of Americans wearing black masks and throwing Molotov cocktails at government buildings. I'm really interested to see what that report is, but I applaud this move because Antifa is a terrorist organization. Any outfit that kills people, that promotes violence, that burns buildings, be they private or corporate or government, they've crossed the line from being peaceful protesters and voicing their opinions and desires, no matter how wayward they may be, into something else, and they need to be dealt with. Just remember Seattle, Portland, Minneapolis, here in the Black Lives Matter days, and more recently, over the last several months, which the press, of course, is doing its best to mask, ignore, and, shall we say, divert your attention with other shiny objects of the day. We'll keep our eye on that. I'm going to do a whole show on the violent left in America because it's really outrageous. I don't know if you are aware, but the AG, the Democratic AG candidate in Virginia, whom the current governor, who's running for a second term against Winsome Sears, who, by the way, is terrific. She is a black woman, not that that matters, but she was a lieutenant governor, and she rocks. Support her. Send her $5 or $10. Winsome Sears. You just dial in Winsome Virginia gubernatorial candidate. You'll find where to send a few shekels. But the AG candidate, okay, this is the violent left, text messages have now emerged where he talks about his biggest wish, his happiest thought, is putting 2 bullets in the head of every Republican. Think about that for a little bit. All right, let's get into the European Union, shall we? So the EU has always been a strong supporter. This is a globalist organization, okay? They are a wet dream for Claude Schwab and his WEF. They really are. And the people who run it are his lackophytes. They lick the boots of the higher-ups in the world order, you know. And they are incompetent. I mean, wholly incompetent and out of touch with reality. And that is one of the reasons the EU is breaking up and destined to completely transform into something not recognizable today within the very near future. It's always been a strong supporter of multilateral, global institutions, which underpin what's called liberal democracy. Okay, liberal democracy is basically globalism. I'll make it really simple for you. And the liberal international order is, the one brave world, you will own nothing. You will own nothing, you will be happy. They created the International Criminal Court. They are one of the biggest supporters and longstanding of the United Nations and the World Trade Organization and all the environmental agreements. Think about the Paris Accord, et cetera, et cetera. Its member states, remember there's 28 of them, I gave you the history in the last show, and institutions, which are feckless, are the largest financial contributor to the UN system. They give about 33%. Little factoid for you. It's not America. America is second. But the European Union gives 33% of the funding to that organization, which ought to be abolished, in my opinion. And they're the leading donor of official development assistance. In other words, they're trying to get their tentacles and their liberal democracy ideas into other places, with about 42% of all UN funding. Okay, they're going to have to scale back on that because the EU is broke, even though they seem not to know it. The Cold War, or the post-Cold War order of post-national liberalism, in other words, liberal democracy, and post-national means there are no more countries, there's no more borders, we're all just one big happy planet, ruled, of course, by the elites who are fleecing us for every dime or shekel or pound or peso that they can. And international institutions and rules supplant, take over, replace national sovereignty in the pursuit of these particular liberal values. That's their mindset over there. And it has been. But they've been facing headwinds for some time, and those headwinds are stiffening. They're beginning to become a gale force. Number one, you have the very, very nationalistic tendencies and the tenacious clinging to sovereignty by Russia and China, who are two formidable adversaries, and the United States when Obama's not in office. The discontent with the liberal order that's been growing and growing and now is growing exponentially over in Europe and around the world has translated into gridlock, folks. They can't get anything done over there. And we'll get into that with the why of that, because it's one of the reasons for their quickening demise in just a moment. But their heavy-handed liberal democracy, such as, you're going to go to jail now in Britain for raising the British flag. I'm really not making that up. I'm really not making that up. Or you can go to jail for posting a political meme in France. I'm not making that up either. Their idea is to weave government, an all-powerful, all-knowing government and its institutions, into economic and cultural globalization. The EU's capacity to address these challenges, which have been arising and are now gathering steam, has been shrinking. Number one, because they have incompetent leaders. Number two, because the EU is set up, if you remember from last week, where although it's a simple majority of the 28 members to do something, take some kind of economic tack, it must be unanimous in terms of, shall we say, internal order and external security. And there are a number of rogue nations now in the EU who simply say no. And we'll get into that in just a moment too. This has been kind of the perfect storm for the EU, right? The perfect set of chaos factors. And it puts the three elements of their liberal vision, if you want to call it a vision, should we say, into play, quite suspect, and, in my opinion, doomed to failure. So right now, out of the 28 nations, there are 7 rogue nations. In other words, they're not going along with anything as members of the EU that the EU wants to do. And there's about to be an 8th, because Austria is now being governed by the press calls them the far right. I'll call them the right-leaning Freedom Party. And that will mean 8 nations out of 28. Now, that's almost 30% of the EU, which is vetoing many of the EU policies in those matters, and they're really critical matters, where one nation, one out of the 28, can veto anything the EU wants to do. Czechoslovakia recently became one of the 8, a right-leaning government elected there. Hungary, who I think rocks. I love Viktor Orban. I love him. Hungary was kind of the original naysayer in the European group. Croatia, Slovakia, and others. And one of the reasons that the EU has resorted to election rigging, such as in Romania just about 6 months ago, and assassinations also in the Eastern European countries, is that the resistance, if you will, is centered right now, although spreading rather rapidly, including France, Germany, and England, in the Eastern Bloc, right? They were under the totalitarian rule of the USSR, Communist Russia, back in the day. They don't want to go there again. Been there, done that, no thanks. And the whole situation has become increasingly through other countries and increasingly through we'll call it the rebels within the EU, untenable in terms of governance of the EU. And because the EU is unable to govern, and because they have incompetent leaders, I mean, the gal who runs the EU right now, the head mucky muck, was the defense minister of Germany. And I'll get her name here in a moment. I got to read it because otherwise I can't pronounce it. Van whatever. And you know what she did to Germany. I mean, Germany is a shell of its former self. Its economy is in collapse. We're going to talk a little bit about that because it's one of the things that's contributing to the demise of the EU. And its military is, well, they're rebuilding like crazy because of what they perceive, because the EU perceives it, or the EU is using the boogeyman to make the public perceive it, you know, the threat of Russia invading Europe. Forget it. Not going to happen. I guess unless you piss the bear off enough and he figures he needs to clean it up so that it doesn't bother him anymore. All right. As the EU has become more feckless, you know, it's something that feeds on itself and unable to make decisions or implement decisions, as the leaders become apparent. I mean, even to the man in the street. I don't care if you're in Lisbon, or you're in Madrid, or you're in London, or you're in Paris, or you're in wherever, okay? It's apparent that the leaders of the EU are totally out of touch with reality, couldn't care less, and have not a clue about the common man, and are unable to do anything competently. Zero. The war in Ukraine being a perfect example. The needless war in Ukraine, I might add. And the needless war in Ukraine, folks, comes from, well, greed, because lots of things come from greed, but it also comes from the insistence of the elite in the EU to try and use military force over the bodies of 1 million sacrificed for liberal democracy Ukrainians, to push their world order, their concept of world order, on Russia, not to mention take its resources. This has all backfired. This whole thing has backfired spectacularly on the European Union elite. And well, it should. They are most deserving of what's coming. They are facing basically unprecedented internal contestation. In other words, internal strife, internal naysayers within the EU. And it's been gaining traction since the early 2000s, and it was underscored by the elections in 2024 throughout Europe for the European Parliament. Okay, the 8 governments, including Austria, who now comprise more than 30% of the EU, who are basically saying no to any globalistic tendencies or policies of the EU, have basically created a situation in which the EU, which was feckless to begin with, is now totally frozen, okay? It really can't do anything. Fragmentation and polarization have also weakened, and I think you'll see them join the rogue nations over time here, the next year or two. France, Germany, and Britain. Britain, of course, supposedly removed itself from the EU in the Brexit, which I told you about in the last show, part of the history of the EU. But in fact, the elites that run London and Britain, as they are aptly demonstrating by their really communist totalitarian policies, are part of the globalist crowd. Okay, so it's a Brexit that hasn't Brexed yet. How's that? I love that little play on words. A Brexit that hasn't Brexed yet. Okay, you have there was a crushing defeat in the European Parliament elections. We're talking about the European Union, the Parliament of the European Union, in which all the countries participate in the governance, as you will, of the European Union. There was a far right, as they call it in the press, national rally. That's the nationalistic party in France. They swept the French elections, and Macron there is down to 13% approval amongst the population. You cannot govern with 13% approval. Impossible. It's just not going to happen. In fact, what you're going to get if you try to continue to govern is a revolution or riots or something along those lines, more chaos. And when this happened, Macron called a snap election, which resulted in a hung parliament. So France is kind of out of the fray because they can't make any decisions or do anything. There's no clear majority in parliament, and they have a titular head of state with a 13% approval rating. The same thing is kind of going on in Germany. And Germany has gone to the point where they're trying to outlaw the ADF, which is we'll call it far right, which is the right-leaning party in Germany, which is also sweeping elections. And of course, in France, the key contender of, we'll call it the Free French forces, those who believe in French sovereignty and those who don't believe in the EU, is Marine Le Pen. And the left there, the communists there, did the same thing they did here in the United States, and the same thing they did in Brazil with Bolsonaro. They trumped up, no pun intended, a bunch of charges and tried to convict Le Pen and tell her that she can't run for office for 5 years. I mean, any trick in the book, along with election rigging and assassinations in Eastern Europe, particularly Romania, which is another country, by the way, when it casts off the shill that the EU installed, despite the popular vote, will be a ninth nation joining the League of Rogues in the EU. So this is challenging the EU's dominance over sovereign nations and the EU's dominance over Europe and the EU's place in the world. And most importantly, the EU's ability to do anything, including try and improve its own quickly deteriorating economic conditions and fastly falling or fastly failing fiat currencies, including the euro, right? The common money, if you will, of the European Union. So divisions between and within the member states, remember, not only do you have divisions in the EU, member state against member state, globalists against sovereign, nationalistic tendencies against kumbaya, we're all one tendencies. But you have huge conflicts now within member states. I told you about France. I told you about Germany. I told you about England. And unlike trade policy, okay, where qualified majority voting involves, in other words, if 15 of the 28 nation states vote for an economic policy, it passes. Doesn't matter what the other 14 think. But foreign and security policy decisions, which is really kind of the point of the spear of globalism, oh no, one dissent and you can't do anything. Your hands are tied. You are frozen in time. And as an example, Hungary, who kind of led the charge of the rebels within the EU, they have vetoed, and now they're joined by others because those ranks are growing, if you will. But they vetoed for quite some time now. They blockaded European funds to partially reimburse weapon deliveries to Ukraine. Good for you, Victor. I mean, let's get the war over, shall we? This is needless stuff. And they could also stifle the ambitions of the elite, who still, unfortunately, run the EU, to create major new funding instruments aimed at arresting the EU's economic and military decline. And economic and military decline is putting it mildly. I mean, these out-of-touch elites of the EU really think they're going to win a war with Russia? Wow. I mean, that's like the 90-pound weakling who, shall we say, has effeminate tendencies going up against the 300-pound weightlifter. It's not going to end well. Not well at all. This will not be a David and Goliath, I guarantee you. The Trump presidency has emboldened all the rebel states and all the rebel factions within the European states. So that's a huge factor here over the last 6 to 12 months, which has given even greater impetus to the disintegration of the European Union, which I believe is actually part of his plan. And President Trump, as a sidelight, blames the European Union for election meddling in 2020. And he seems to have a long memory, as Director Comey has found out. Mr. Bolton is about to find out, apparently. Letitia James has a little tidbit. Remember Letitia James? She was prosecuting Trump for business fraud. You know, Mar-a-Lago was only worth $18 million when it's worth about $500 million. She was just indicted for mortgage fraud. Huh. Wow. How the worm turns, folks. How the worm turns. Anyway, Trump's preference for bilateral and bilateral transactional types of diplomacy. In other words, he sits down with one leader at a time. He doesn't sit down with a group, okay, unless he's dressing down the United Nations and telling them what morons they are. But because he's working with each nation independently over there, they are not able to function as a group. And each nation is making deals with the United States that best suits them. The European Union, as a cohesive bloc, which it's not, is being cut out of the deals. So that is also contributing to the fray of the fabric of the EU, as you were. All right, so that kind of gives you the overall big view. But here's a couple of tidbits for you, which goes right to what I've been telling you. China is also trying to take advantage of the discord in the EU by getting its economic, governance, social tentacles into European nations. I mean, this is what China does. They do it in South America. They do it in Africa. They're doing it in Europe. They do it in Southeast Asia. I mean, it's their MO. And it's very clever, I might add. And they do it without bombs and weapons and all that kind of stuff. They've done it here to us in the United States in terms of education and, should we say, the offshoring of critical jobs and critical manufacturing abilities to them by carefully pulling the strings of capitalism. Remember what Karl Marx said? In the end, I will hang the capitalists by their own profits. Yes, very true. So China has this huge internet company called JD.com. And it's a electronics-oriented internet company. And they now have bought access through European internet companies into the European electronics market. Gee, what do you think that's going to do to European electronics manufacturers? It's going to kill them, is what it's going to do. And Europe, because they're led by morons and because they are fixated, quite wrongfully, on Ukraine, rather than buying Russian oil and gas to try and revive their economies, which are energy starved. It's one of the reasons their economies are falling apart. You know, the green, the wind, the solar. Instead of buying Russian oil and Russian gas, although pipelines have been blown up, thank you, Joe Biden, Obama's third term, they've also now levied sanctions on India. You know, it's only 1.6 billion people. You don't want to piss that market off. I mean, who cares about them? Right. As the United States, I think, mistakenly did just a month ago. I told you about that on a show, too. So they are now sanctioning India over buying Russian oil. Well, India, obviously, is turning more and more to the BRICS countries, which are actually the economic arch rivals, and in other ways, too, of the European Union, the America and the West. And, you know, they're driving their friends into the arms of their enemies, which the left likes to do because, remember, the left is not interested in the right outcome. They're only interested in their outcome, which they believe is the only way to go. Spain's power grid, you know, they're having all sorts of blackouts over there in Europe. And I mean, like, virtually in every country. But particularly in what's called the PIGS countries, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and Greece. And I've brought you those stories. In fact, if you want to see what started over there, go to the archives and listen to the show called Greece is California. I did that like 8 or 9 years ago. And it will tell you, it will foreshadow for you exactly the show I'm bringing you today though the situation has greatly deteriorated and advanced. Spain's power grid operator, right? The national Spanish power grid, warns of new blackouts. There's not enough power. By the way, folks, if you don't have enough power, never mind your population and all the things that go along with that, how do you reformat and gear up your manufacturing sector, since manufacturing needs power? How do you stay competitive in what is the key AI race around the world? I mean, one of the first things China has done over the last 10 years is to triple their ability to output power internally within the country. They saw all this coming. They know what these data centers and all this, how much power all these centers are taking, what type of power manufacturing takes, particularly since they took the manufacturing from the EU and America. And America is lagging behind, although catching up quickly. The EU is stuck with morons running the EU who insist on the sun shining and the wind blowing. It's not going to work, okay? After the $7 trillion over the last 10 years that's been thrown at green energy projects around the world, exactly 1%, that's one, see my single finger there? 1% of the world's power has switched from fossil fuels to wind and solar, or any type of green energy. 81% of the world's power is still fossil fuels. So much for that grand idea. And then we have the Eurozone's debt crisis, the collapse of their fiat currencies. We're going to be talking about that in the next show, but particularly relative to the dollar. And the yuan. I mean, there is no country that is immune from the collapse of their fiat currencies. Fiat is paper, okay? Other things, tangible assets, are money, real money. They started off in the EU with a sovereign debt crisis. That was in 2009. It grew out of the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And the PIGS countries, right, Greece, Portugal, Italy, Spain, basically went broke. The EU had to step in and bail them out. And that weakened the financial structure of the EU and of certain of their member states. And that weakening has never ceased. It's just gotten more and more pronounced. And now it's a contagion that's spreading to other countries within the EU system and within the EU itself. The two largest economies in the Eurozone, Germany and France. The presidents of those two countries, Sarkozy back in those days in France, and Angela Merkel, oh God, what a winner. Angela Merkel in Germany tried to step in and spearhead the efforts to stabilize the euro, right? The common currency of the European Union. And at that time, it had plunged to a 4-year low. It's since gotten worse against the US dollar. And they tried to preserve the solvency, literally the solvency, not just the ability to operate, but whether or not they were bankrupt, of those 4 members in particular and several other EU members that were teetering on the brink, like Cyprus, for instance. And they imposed through the EU austerity measures and loans, which further pissed off the populations of those countries and have now led, right, 10 years later, think about this, how this all works. 10 to 15 years later, it takes time for things to foment, to the popular uprisings in all these countries that are now the rogue states in the European Union. I mean, there is no action that does not generate a reaction. And when you have morons taking the action, they do not foresee, or they believe it cannot happen to them because they are them. They do not foresee where it's going to lead. There's been a lack of any enforcement for so-called fiscal rules in the EU. They were originally outlined in the Maastricht Treaty, the 1993 treaty, which really created the EU. Listen to my show from last week. And they attempted, the EU leaders, in response to all these problems after the great financial crisis, to kind of come to a new fiscal pact, if you were, a treaty in March of 2012. It was called the European Stability Mechanism, which was like a permanent bailout fund that showed you that they kind of really knew what was going on, that replaced the temporary rescue measures they were using for the pigs and other faltering economies and countries in the European Union. However, because this took the European Commission trying to mandate that the European Central Bank, right, the ECB, would be the central bank, and that all 6,000 other financial institutions in all the 28 member countries would be subservient and merely fingers of the ECB arm. People said no. Right? Once again, they misjudged their power, and they misjudged the power of national sovereignty, and with disastrous effects that are now playing out again, 10 to 15 years later today. Okay, in early 2014, the EU faced what its greatest foreign policy crisis. This was when the CIA under Obama and the witches and wizards that he had working for him, the anti-American witches and wizards, did the color revolution and staged the coup in Ukraine. And Russia promptly took Crimea from Ukraine. And that was the seeds of the current war. That's right. The West and America started this war, not Russia. In fact, Merkel from Germany actually cackled that the Minsk Treaty, which basically created a peace between Russia and Europe and some commonality between the two factions. Remember, back there in the 90s, Russia wanted to join NATO. So how far we have drifted apart since then. But Merkel actually cackled in public, that they signed the Minsk Treaty with Russia only to fool them and to buy time to build the military. Now, if you were Vladimir Putin, exactly what would you think about doing any deals with scoundrels like this? Or being under the illusion that peace was possible with them, or being able to trust them in anything. And then it's compounded by Obama and his globalist morons taking $300 billion of Russian assets, stealing them out of the reserves. Listen, I don't like Vladimir Putin. But Russia should be an ally of the West and an enemy, or at least an antagonist, toward China. These policies of these moron globalists, both in America and Europe, have driven Russia into China's arms and created a formidable alliance, even though I think eventually that's going to break down too, because I think China lusts after Russia's land and resources and has a much bigger army than Russia and a 2,000-mile border with Russia. We shall see how all that plays out in the coming decades. Anyway, this whole financial system was voted down because they overreached, as progressives, communists, and globalists tend to do, and tried to grab too much of the pie. So, after the 2014 debacle in Ukraine, which has led to the current conflict and the death of between 1 and 1.5 million poor Ukrainians. I mean, these people have been they are the bloody puppets of the morons running things, or who have run things in the West. And there were all sorts of false flags and such. I mean, this has been a long time coming, but it was precipitated by the scurrilous actions of the European Union leaders back then. And by the way, they've grown no less scurrilous today. And then Austria, okay? So Brussels is struggling with what's called Euroscepticism. Euroscepticism means people who go, hey, enough of this European Union deal. Let's all us countries be countries and stand on our own. I'm making it really easy. The National Front in France, the UK Independence Party, or UKIP in Britain, and all the various parties in all the various countries around Europe. There's almost no country now that does not have a rather vocal, and in many cases, highly powerful right-leaning faction, which, by the way, does not bode well for the European Union either in the near future. In 2015, the Eurosceptic parties, we'll call them, we'll lump them all together, began to capitalize on the ongoing migrant crisis. How about the illegal alien invasion in Europe, which, by the way, folks, was a coordinated effort, I just want you to know this, between Obama, who is a communist, a globalist, and an Islamist, and the European Union, who are globalists and communists. And Obama created the refugee crisis by his actions in Syria and other places in the Mideast. That generated 6 million refugees. Yemen, Lebanon, you name it. I mean, every action was taken to uproot people and make them move. And the movement in that case was primarily to Europe. And the same problems with illegal immigration in Europe are those problems that we face here in the United States. Okay? Hundreds of thousands of refugees continue to pour into Europe. There is such unrest, for instance, in Britain and in France, that there have been demonstrations. It was estimated that 2 million people participated in a demonstration against the government and its lack of migration controls in London very recently, and 800,000, this is huge, in Paris, in France. In the meantime, Macron, illusions of grandeur, not stepping down, 13% approval, parliament deadlocked, lost the last national election, is now telling Europe that France will be the nuclear umbrella for all of the European Union. Oh, France. Okay. What do you got over there? You got 100, 150 nukes there, buddy, that half of them that the United States, they really belong to the United States. You're just kind of safe keeping them. And Russia has 5,200 nukes, 20 times your land area, 3 times your population, and 10 times, and leaders who are 10 times more competent than you and all the rest of the European leaders, well, other than the rogue nations, the rest of the European leaders put together. Good luck with that. Good luck. I mean, wow, what fairy tale land do you live in? And facing pressure from UKIP in Britain, okay, supposedly the Conservative Party Prime Minister at that time, David Cameron, tried to undertake a renegotiation between the EU and the United Kingdom in 2015 and 2016 to smooth the Brexit process. In my opinion, it was to delay and forestall the Brexit process, which had been voted on, but that's a whole nother, that's a rabbit hole I won't go down in this show. Although the successive leaders to Brown in England have pledged to carry out the Brexit vote, which was 52% of the vote in 2016, June 2016, by the English population, they have done just the opposite, which has led to even more unrest and greater popularity of the UKIP, right? The right-leaning factions in Britain. In 2017, the then Prime Minister of England, Theresa May, you probably remember that name, had virtually no majority in parliament. So she called for a snap election, which you can do under parliamentarian law. It's different than the republic, the Constitution, the republic, and all that kind of stuff over here in the United States. It backfired spectacularly, okay? Her conservative party, and I put conservative in quotes, lost its majority entirely. And she had to resign or face calls for resignation as the prime minister. And Parliament became gridlocked, just like the European Union. And plans to implement Brexit have been waylaid by lack of plurality 3 times, which leads to further uncertainty and instability in the EU. And she was succeeded, by the way, by Boris Johnson. Oh, yeah, Boris, who was a conservative, who was a globalist in conservative clothing. Okay. Boris Johnson is the one, if you remember, which he's the guy at the inception of the Ukrainian war. That's right, shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. They were that far from a peace deal. And he flew in and told Zelensky, no peace deal. The European Union won't back it. In other words, scuttled what could have been a peace and the saving of 1.5 million lives, not to mention the damage and destruction and angst and the ripping asunder of assets and families. And I mean, it's just a horrible situation over there. So Boris Johnson, right, acting on behalf of the EU, showing his true colors, which was not as a sovereign British citizen, flew in and wrecked a peace that could have been established right at that time, at the inception of the real meat of this grinding conflict. Ursula von der Leyen, Vonderleyen, that is who runs the European Union now. That is the babe. Oh, so sorry. I shouldn't say that. That is the globalist monster that now runs the European Union. She ran Germany into the ground, and she is doing the same thing with the European Union. Most observers, and most of them far smarter than me, consider her to be absolutely the worst titular head of state, of any organization on the planet Earth at the current time. She is terrible. She is not smart. She is entrenched in leftist ideology. She is wed inextricably to the globalist agenda. She is completely out of touch with the common man and cares not a whit about the success of any sovereign nation or the European Union. She's all about one big happy planet with her at the head of it, along with Klaus Schwab, I guess, where you own nothing and you will be happy. That is her mantra. And everything she does is based on that mantra. Nothing she does is based on common sense or the good of the people or the good of the member states of the European Union, which is further exacerbating the splits, the acrimony, and the antagonism between states, which is further undermining the European Union feeble attempts to try and correct its economic, its financial, its military, its security ship. All right, and then of course she came right, CV-19, which Europe and the European leaders just jumped on with abandon. You know, wear your mask, stay home, shut down the economy. I mean, this is all part of the plan, folks. All part of the plan. I mean, the whole story will come out one day. Okay, but the Obama goons in the United States, who never really relinquished power during Trump's first term, shame on Trump, and all the European Union globalist goons, and other countries working in their sovereign interests, such as China, CV-19 was a manufactured deal. It was a manufactured bug with American and European money and some private money, thank you, Bill Gates, in a Chinese military lab. I mean, you know the story. I've brought it to you a million times. People laughed at me when I first brought it to you, which, by the way, I was the first one, right? December of 2019, I began telling you about what was going on in China with this strange bug. And then, of course, in January, all hell broke loose. And I was first reported then, too. And everything I have told you about CV-19 and the jabs and all the rest, although people laughed at me and I was excoriated by certain other media people, has turned out to be 100, not 99, 100% true, and has been borne out. And the European Union, the globalists, use CV-19 to further their globalist ends, creating even more backlash, acrimony, and disassociation within the EU, and printing lots of money to further undermine their fiat currencies and to undermine their economies, and using CV-19 to further implement and inject, like a poison pill, their green energy concepts and their shutdown of fossil fuel energy sources, all of which are coming, all these lines are converging right now for the EU. It's a mess. I'm going to follow it for you. But in my opinion, the EU will cease to exist. It has already really ceased to function. Will cease to exist as a cohesive unit, economically, militarily, and in terms of, shall we say, liberal democracy thought over the next 1 to 3 year period, with huge effects on the United States, China, Russia, and the world. And we'll talk about those in the future. But you can imagine that if you got 4 powers, 3 of them dominant, 1 of them kind of secondary, the European Union, and 1 of them drops out, then there's a power vacuum. And when there's a power vacuum, the other 3 powers, because it's their nature, will try and fill it, which will create lots of opportunity for head-on conflicts, either physical or subversive, covert, within the lands and for the resources and for the manufacturing and for the monies in the economy of the power that has fallen. So there's greater effect to the demise of the European Union than just the demise of the European Union. Think about that. And it's a great lead up to my next show, which is going to be the reality of today's money. That's what it's going to be called, the reality of today's money. It will, some of you get it. Some of you already know it. Some of you innately know it. But some of you are going to be shocked. And I'm going to have all the facts, figures, and, shall we say, receipts for you. You will not be able to argue with either the facts or the conclusion. And it is key that you understand this and that you begin to move immediately for your benefit, for the benefit of your family, and I think eventually for your freedoms. This is Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take. Remember, please pass the link on, hit the like, hit the subscribe, whatever channel you're on, and we're on piles of them everywhere. And you have a great couple of days till we talk again. Keep the wind at your back.
Please remember, if you've missed any shows, just click on Show Archive and you'll find all of his shows. We look forward to seeing you here again next week for another episode of Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side.